"Lower your head, old man. I decide who gets to live here." Sergeant Tyler Kane snarled inside the field medical tent, yanking hard on Harold Whitman's wrist and throwing the old ring onto the dusty ground. "Who are you trying to scare with this prop, or are you pretending to be a veteran to get priority?" Laughter burst out, harsh and shameless, as if humiliating a 70-year-old man were a privilege that came with wearing a uniform. But only a few seconds later, the atmosphere suddenly shifted. Footsteps echoed from the entrance of the tent. Major General Robert Thorne stepped inside, and the entire tent froze as his gaze swept over the scene before him. He straightened his posture and solemnly raised his hand in salute to Harold. "Sir." The entire medical tent fell into stunned silence. There was no more laughter, no more contemptuous looks, because in that moment, the truth was laid bare. The old man who had just been humiliated was someone who had walked through war, who had stood in medical stations where lives were reclaimed, second by second, and who had saved more soldiers than all those shouting here combined. If you were Harold, publicly trampled on, would you stand up or remain silent to survive? Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Does true power lie in rank or in character? The COVID-19 pandemic did not create war. It merely pulled back the curtain, exposing what had been rotting for a very long time. In this land, once marked on military maps with the words, "heavy casualties," the war had ended decades ago, but its memory had never left. Guns were replaced with stretchers, explosions with rasping coughs, and it was all called relief. The United States Marine Corps Field Medical Station was hastily erected on old ground. Canvas tents were stretched tight with ropes driven deep into soil once churned apart by explosives. No one spoke about it. There was no need to. Those who had lived here knew. Those who had just arrived did not care. In moments like this, history could not save anyone from oxygen deprivation. The smell of disinfectant was so strong it burned the throat the moment one reached the entrance. It mixed with the stench of old sweat, the hot metallic odor of ventilators, and the fear of bodies pushed beyond their limits. Civilians formed a long line outside the general practice tent, standing close together, despite repeated reminders to maintain social distancing. They came from different places, spoke different languages, carried different stories, but their eyes were the same, exhausted, disoriented, and driven into a corner. There was no justice here, only order. No one asked who was right or wrong. They only asked who would be treated first, who would have to wait, and who might die while waiting. A young medic shouted continuously, his voice hoarse from the mask and the strain, ordering people to keep their distance, those coughing badly to step back, those struggling to breathe to raise their hands. Each command sounded like an invisible blade, cutting into a crowd already stretched thin. Someone could no longer stay upright. A middle-aged woman collapsed, her hand clutching the shoulder of the person in front of her as a final reflex. Two medics immediately pulled her aside and placed her on a temporary stretcher. "Not your turn yet," one of them said quickly, without meeting her eyes. The stretcher was pushed away, leaving a gap in the line that was instantly filled. No one spoke. Everyone understood that speaking up would not make the line move faster. In the midst of that crowd, Harold Whitman stood still. He was over 70, his back slightly hunched, his breathing slow and steady. He did not push forward, did not ask questions, did not try to draw attention. He had stood in worse lines than this long ago. He knew that the loudest person was often the first to be noticed, and in overloaded systems, being noticed did not mean being saved. Harold's eyes were different from those around him. They were not panicked, nor pleading. They belonged to someone who had waited in circumstances where a single wrong step could cost a life. He observed the medical station as if it were familiar ground. Even though everything had changed, the tents were different, the equipment was different, and the people were different, but the rhythm was the same. Pressure, haste, clipped orders, and decisions made in an instant. On Harold's left wrist, an old silver band slipped out from his sleeve as he adjusted his stance. It was tarnished, scratched, bearing a strange symbol that matched no modern patient classification system. It was not a priority band, not an identification tag. It looked like something forgotten from another era, an era most of those present knew only through films or history books. Harold paid no attention to the band. He was used to its weight against his skin. Like a scar, you do not need to see to know it is there. It had been placed on his wrist in a wartime medical station, when its meaning had nothing to do with power or privilege. It simply marked that he had narrowly survived, and that without monitoring, he would die again. Those who had worn such bands never needed to be reminded. The crowd shifted forward in small increments. A cough echoed behind him. A child cried. Another medic hurried past, a tray of instruments gleaming under the temporary lights. Harold followed the movement with his eyes, then returned his gaze to the space ahead. He did not know how long he would have to wait. He did not ask. Waiting, in many cases, was simply another form of endurance. A gaze settled on his wrist. It was not accidental. It was sharp, probing, carrying the familiar judgment of those who believed they had the right to determine another person's worth. Harold sensed it before he heard any words. Years of experience had taught him to recognize moments like this faster than sound. Laughter broke out behind him, short and dry, like a piece of metal striking concrete. It carried no amusement, only the sound of asserting status. A few people in line turned their heads slightly, then quickly looked away. No one wanted to be pulled in. A voice followed the laughter, young, confident, and laced with contempt disguised as humor. "Hey, where did all this old junk come from anyway?" The question was thrown out without expecting an answer. It was loud enough for others to hear, and clear enough for its target to know he had been marked. Harold did not turn around immediately. He continued to stare straight ahead, at the general practice, tent door opening and closing, swallowing one person after another. But his eyes shifted subtly, not from fear, but from knowing that his moment of quiet had ended. On the ground that had once buried the dead, confrontations rarely required guns. They began with seemingly harmless words, and ended with someone being pushed to the margins once again. The laughter at the end of the line was still hanging in the air, when a tall figure broke away from the group of soldiers standing near the tent entrance. Tyler Kane strode straight forward, his boots striking the hard ground with short, decisive sounds. He did not greet anyone, nor did he bother to glance at the intake board or the patient list. To Kane, order did not exist on paper. Order existed in those who dared to remain still when he approached. He stopped in front of Harold, standing close enough to block the overhead light. Kane lowered his head and looked down at the old silver bracelet still visible beneath Harold's sleeve. His eyes lit up, as if he had found something small enough to crush yet strange enough to put on display. "What is this?" Kane asked, his tone calm but carrying his familiar scrutiny. Before Harold could answer, Kane reached out. The movement was fast, sharp, without warning. He yanked Harold's wrist toward himself, the force strong enough to make Harold's shoulder tilt slightly. The bracelet slipped free and settled neatly into Kane's palm. A few people in line released quiet breaths, then froze, as if they themselves had just been jerked forward. Kane lifted the bracelet to eye level, turning it slightly to see the faded markings. He curled his lip, then turned and tossed it to a private standing nearby. "A prop," Kane said loudly, his voice laced with mockery, loud enough for the entire line to hear. The bracelet flew through the air, struck the other man's hand, then was tossed up again. Laughter burst from the group of soldiers, harsh and hollow, the kind of sound used to stamp approval on an authorized form of entertainment. A few other laughs followed, scattered and hesitant, then quickly died out. The crowd understood perfectly when to laugh along and when to stay silent. Kane turned back to face the line, spreading his arms as if presenting a farce. "An old man pretending to be a veteran to cut the line," he said loudly. The question was thrown out without needing an answer. It was an accusation, wrapped in a joking tone to evade responsibility. A man standing near Harold lowered his head, pretending to adjust his mask. A woman behind him stepped back half a pace, as if afraid of being caught in Kane's gaze. No one spoke, no one intervened. In this station, Kane's attention meant trouble. Harold remained still. His breathing was slow, steady, unbroken. He looked toward the entrance of the GP tent, where another patient was being pulled inside. The sound of the zipper rang out, then disappeared. He let Kane's words pass over him as he had let many other things pass through his life. That silence made Kane frown. He took another half step forward, leaning in closer, his voice dropping low but sharp as a blade. "People like you are finished," Kane said, each word pressed firmly, as if he were reading out a sentence already prepared. "Here, no one needs old junk." He lifted his head and swept a Q-lance along the line, checking reactions. A few eyes looked away, a few heads bowed. There was no objection. That pleased Kane. He believed this silence was an acknowledgement of his standing. The bracelet was tossed back. It fell to the ground in front of Harold's boot, rolled a short distance, then stopped. Kane folded his arms and waited. Harold bent down, picked up the bracelet, brushed the dust from it, and slipped it back onto his wrist. The movement was slow and firm, carrying neither haste nor defiance. A young medic standing a few steps away witnessed everything. He turned his face aside, pretending to check a supply crate nearby. His jaw tightened, but his feet did not move. In this station, intervening meant placing oneself on the list to be dealt with. Kane let out a soft laugh, brief and cold. He stepped sideways to block Harold, his body forming a clear barrier between him and the entrance. "Here," Kane said, his voice carrying loudly enough that no one could miss it. "Priority is for those who still have value." The sentence dropped onto the line like a stamped seal. The air thickened. A few people swallowed hard. Others stared down at their feet. Harold lifted his head, his gaze resting on Kane's face for the first time. That look was calm, carrying neither pleading nor anger, only the clear observation of someone who had seen men like Kane standing in many other places. Kane held his posture, believing he had ended the exchange. He did not realize that the moment he claimed the right to judge who still had value and who should be left behind, the power he relied on had begun to show its first cracks. In this medical station built on old graves, every judgment left an echo, and that echo had never truly faded. After Kane's remark, the line of people in front of the GP tent sagged, as if another layer of pressure had been poured onto it. Inside the tent, the sounds continued at a steady pace. The ventilator, footsteps, the rasp of zippers, but outside, the air thickened. Kane stood there, occupying the entire space in front of Harold, as though that position were a judgment platform built specifically for him. "Old achievements don't buy medicine today," Kane said, his tone casual, as if stating an obvious rule. He glanced toward the intake board, then looked back at Harold. "Here, what counts is the present. As for those old stories," he shrugged, "save them for another time." A sergeant standing behind Kane let out a soft laugh, then added, his voice just loud enough, "You should know your place." The words landed quickly, cleanly, without need for explanation. In this station, one's place was decided from above, and those below had no right to question it. Harold heard every word. They were not new. They were familiar enough that he could predict the rhythm before the sentence ended. He looked down at his left hand, where the wristband had just been removed and then put back on. The fleeting emptiness he felt when Kane yanked it away was still there, like a memory brushing against the skin. In Harold's mind, the image of another medical station surfaced, not a white tent, but a dark space, the smell of blood stronger than that of medicine. Screams overlapped, metal stretchers clanged against the ground, names were shouted and swallowed by chaos. Back then, the band had been fastened around his wrist with a single meaning to mark that he was still alive, and that without monitoring, that life would slip away very quickly. The people around him at that time had no time for contempt. Harold gently clenched his empty hand, then relaxed it. A small gesture, but enough to keep his breathing steady. He stood still, letting the memories pass without dragging emotion along with them. In front of him now was Kane, not the old battlefield, and the system Kane represented operated by different rules, but its nature was not unfamiliar. Kane stepped closer, until the distance between them was no more than a single breath. "Or do you want me to send you outside to lie down?" Kane asked, lowering his voice, a threat wrapped in a joking tone. "The air out there is easier to breathe." A few people in the line shifted slightly, creating more space, as if that space might soften the situation. No one laughed anymore. Eyes began to focus on Harold and Kane, waiting for a reaction, an outburst, or a plea. This medical station was all too familiar with such scenes. Harold remained silent. He looked straight at Kane, then glanced toward the tent entrance, where a medic was calling the next patient's name. His silence did not last long, but it was enough to throw off the rhythm of the exchange. Kane felt it. He hated this silence. It did not give him what he wanted. It did not give him the confirmation that he was winning. "Did you hear what I said?" Kane asked, his voice slightly higher. He was used to his words triggering an immediate reaction. Here, he did not get that. The crowd began to observe more closely. An elderly man standing behind Harold narrowed his eyes, as if trying to see through the situation. A young woman clutched her bag tightly to her chest, her gaze wavering between fear and curiosity. No one spoke, but attention had shifted. Kane was no longer the center of laughter, but the center of a heavy anticipation. Kane frowned. He recognized the change. He was accustomed to controlling space with his voice and gestures. When silence was no longer submission, it became a challenge. He inhaled, about to say something more, then paused for a brief moment, as if weighing the necessity of the next level of violence. Harold still stood there, breathing evenly, his gaze calm. He understood very clearly what Kane was doing. This system functioned by forcing the weak into reacting. A negative reaction would be punished. A correct reaction could also be punished. Silence, in many cases, was the only way to observe and wait for the right moment. A young medic standing near the tent entrance glanced over, then returned to his work. He felt the pressure spreading, but chose to focus on the list in front of him. In this station, any delay could be assigned as personal responsibility. Kane cleared his throat, as if to pull attention back. "There's no place for these silent games here," he said sharply. "You think standing still will get you through?" Harold did not answer. He looked down at the band on his wrist, then back up at Kane. The pause stretched for another beat, long enough for Kane to feel that he was being drawn into a game whose rules he did not know. In the line, someone began to whisper, very softly, not words of protest, but fragmented questions. Who was this man? Why was he being treated like this? Those questions did not reach Kane's ears, but they existed, spreading, changing the atmosphere. Kane sensed control slipping away. He hated that feeling. He was used to clarity, orders given, reactions immediate. Harold's silence, combined with the crowd's watchful eyes, made him feel as though he himself was now under scrutiny. Just as Kane was about to speak again, a faint metallic sound rang out behind him, not loud, but clear enough in the silence that had formed. The sound of a hinge opening, lightly touching a cabinet frame. Kane turned his head on instinct. Several people in the line turned as well. The sound came from the medicine storage area inside the tent. Attention shifted. Harold heard the sound, and understood that the order of this moment was about to change. In a medical station built on old graves, small sounds often signaled that something larger was beginning. Have you ever been insulted simply for staying silent? Comment if you were there. Would you speak up, or lower your head? The sound of metal came from inside the GP tent, not loud, but sharp enough to cut across the confrontation, tightening at the entrance. A hinge opened slightly, then snapped shut in a hurry. With everyone already on edge, that sound felt out of place, like a wrong note in a piece of music that was already painfully loud. Harold heard it and turned on instinct. His gaze no longer rested on Kane, but stopped at the temporary medical supply area inside, where fluorescent lights cast a cold, flat glow. He saw a corporal standing close to the shelves, moving faster than necessary. The man's hand hesitated briefly, then a small vial disappeared into a jacket pocket, smooth and practiced, as if the motion had been rehearsed many times before. Among the crowd, few noticed. Most eyes were still fixed on Kane, on the public judgment that had just played out. But Harold was different. He had seen hands like that in other places, under other circumstances, where every vial taken meant a life that would not be saved. Experience allowed him to recognize irregularity faster than any explanation could. Harold took a step forward. The distance was small, but it was enough to shift his position in the space. He was no longer standing in a passive line. He was stepping into an area Kane clearly considered his own territory. "What medicine was that?" Harold asked. His voice was not loud, but it was clear. It carried no accusation and no hesitation. The question came as a natural reflex, the reflex of someone accustomed to knowing exactly what was being used, and why. The entire tent paused for half a beat. Whispering stopped. A medic who had been writing froze with pen, mid-air. The corporal who had hidden the medicine stiffened for an instant, then forced himself to appear normal, tugging the zipper of his jacket a little higher. Harold did not stop there. He looked directly toward the supply shelves, then turned to Kane. "Who authorized it to be taken outside?" he asked next. The question dropped into the space like a heavy object, needing no further explanation. Kane spun around sharply. His attention was dragged away from the earlier display. Abruptly and roughly, his face flushed. Whether from anger or from realizing something sensitive had just been touched was unclear. He strode toward Harold, ignoring the corporal frozen by the shelves. "What are you asking?" Kane roared. His voice echoed inside the tent, bouncing off canvas and metal. "What rank do you think you carry? Daring to question things here." A few scattered laughs came from a group of soldiers nearby. They were no longer confident laughs, but broken sounds, driven more by habit than genuine support. The crowd sensed a shift in the air. Harold's question had pushed the confrontation in another direction, one where Kane no longer held complete control. Harold stood still. He met Kane's gaze without flinching. In that moment, he was not looking at a corporal, nor at a bully. He was looking at a man trying to hold power through a voice louder than necessary. "Here," Kane continued, his voice dropping into a growl. "We follow procedure. Who do you think you are?" Interfering, Harold did not answer immediately. He glanced toward the corporal near the supply area. That look alone was enough to make the man turn his face away, his hand unconsciously tightening around his pocket. Then Harold looked back at Kane. "I'm asking," Harold said slowly, "because that is my military medical supply, not personal property." The statement was not raised in volume, but it clarified what Kane was trying to ignore. A few people in line began whispering, very softly, not protests, but fragmented questions. What medicine? Why was it taken? And, was it allowed? Those questions crept through the space, wearing down the confidence behind the roar. Kane stepped closer, the distance between them shrinking, until those nearby were forced to step back. "You think you understand this system," he said. "You think seeing a vial gives you the right to interrogate." He turned toward the corporal who had hidden the medicine, and barked a short order. "Get back to work." The man nodded hastily, avoiding Harold's eyes, and moved away. Harold followed the movement, then turned back to Kane. "If there's nothing wrong," he said, "then answering shouldn't be difficult." The words made Kane freeze for a brief moment, not long enough for the crowd to notice, but long enough for him to feel cornered into responding. He was not used to being questioned this way, calm, direct, unafraid. "You're causing trouble," Kane said, his voice rising. "This place is overloaded. We don't have time for these little doubts." "Then clarity matters even more," Harold replied, "because every vial has someone waiting for it." A medic near the tent entrance glanced at Kane, then toward the supply area. The look was withdrawn quickly, but it existed. More, looks like it began to appear, scattered, not unified, but enough for Kane to sense that the situation was slipping beyond familiar boundaries. "That's enough," Kane said, forcing firmness back into his voice. "You're overstepping your authority." Harold looked at Kane without blinking. The gaze was neither defiant nor pleading. It was the look of someone who had asked a question and was waiting for an answer, whether the other person liked it or not. Inside the GP tent, a cough echoed, long and strained, then faded. Another stretcher was pushed through, its wheels squealing against the dirt floor. Life in the station went on, but in this small pocket of space, everything slowed, revolving around an unanswered question. Kane realized that if he did not shut this down immediately, it would spread. He drew in a deep breath, then let out a mocking laugh, trying to turn tension into a joke. "Listen," he said, "old man, these things aren't meant for you." A few weak laughs answered him. No one laughed loudly. Harold lifted his chin, his voice maintaining the same measured pace. "I ask because I saw it," he said, "and because I know where it leads." Kane opened his mouth to continue, then stopped. He looked at Harold again, this time more carefully, as if trying to read something in those eyes. The surrounding crowd fell silent, waiting, not for an order, but for an answer. Harold held that gaze for another beat, then spoke, each word released slowly, clear enough for everyone to hear. "I don't carry any rank to threaten you with." The words Harold spoke hung suspended inside the GP tent, needing no emphasis yet impossible to ignore. Kane stood facing him and realized that the moment had slipped off its familiar track. He had been waiting for a different reaction, an explanation, a plea, or at least some awkward hesitation. What he received instead was an answer that refused to stand in the position of being questioned. Kane burst into loud laughter, louder than before, as if trying to pull the atmosphere back to his side. "So, a civilian," he said, laughing and shaking his head, as though he had found a weakness to exploit. He turned toward the group of soldiers nearby, searching for the familiar response. He tilted his head, his gaze sweeping from Harold's wrist up to his face, then stopping at those calm eyes. "Or a self-proclaimed veteran," Kane went on, his voice drawn out with a hint of mockery. The question was thrown out with the intent to belittle, to turn everything that had just happened into a ridiculous misunderstanding. A few laughs rang out, short and uncertain. No one laughed out loud the way they had before. The crowd could sense that the story was moving in a different direction, one where jokes were beginning to feel out of place. Harold did not answer immediately. He paused for a brief beat, long enough for everyone to realize that the reply coming next would not be spoken hastily. He looked at Kane, then glanced along the line of people waiting, tired faces following his smallest movement. "I have earned the right," Harold said, his voice low and clear. He stopped precisely there, letting the unfinished sentence fall into the space. The pause caused the entire tent to sag inward. A medic who had been walking came to a halt. Someone in the line held their breath without realizing it. The whole tent seemed to be waiting for the rest of the sentence. Kane opened his mouth to cut in, then stopped. He realized that any words spoken at that moment could destroy the advantage he was trying to maintain. "Not to wear it," Harold continued. The sentence was complete, not raised in volume, needing no further explanation, yet it was enough to kill the remaining laughter. The scattered sounds that had lingered vanished instantly, as if someone had sucked the air out of the tent. A few people in line blinked, as if to make sure they had heard correctly. Kane stood frozen for exactly one breath, not long, but long enough to reveal something rare. He did not know how to react. Harold's statement did not challenge him directly, nor did it follow the logic Kane was used to handling. It did not place Kane in a position to argue, but instead pushed him into having to explain why he had the right to ask those questions in the first place. "What did you say?" Kane asked again, his voice lower than before. He tried to keep his composure, but his eyes had changed. The certainty that had helped him stand firm in previous confrontations was beginning to waver. Harold did not repeat himself. He looked at Kane calmly, as if the answer had already been fully given. To him, there was nothing more to add. The right he spoke of was not something that could be proven with paperwork at that moment. It existed in the way he stood, the way he questioned, and the way he refused to be drawn into Kane's game. A medic near the tent entrance glanced at Harold, then down at the intake board. That person's hand tightened around the stack of papers. Another sergeant shifted his footing, unconsciously stepping back half a step. Small movements, but enough for Kane to realize that the atmosphere was turning. "Listen," Kane said, trying to reclaim his old tone. "No one here cares about cryptic remarks." He pointed toward Harold, then waved his hand lightly, as if brushing away the irritation that had just surfaced. "Are you here for medicine, or are you here to cause trouble?" Harold turned his head to follow the direction of Kane's hand, toward the supply area. His gaze stopped on the metal cabinet door that had been hastily closed earlier. He looked for another brief beat, then turned back to Kane. "And those vials," Harold said, his voice still measured and slow, "are not permitted to leave that place." The words landed clearly, without detours. They were not aimed at Kane personally. They were aimed at the order Kane was trying to protect. The crowd immediately understood that the situation had moved beyond a personal insult. Kane spun back in the direction Harold had been looking. He saw the medicine cabinet, saw the figure standing nearby, saw several pairs of eyes watching his reaction. In that moment, he realized that every move he made next was being observed. "What are you accusing me of?" Kane demanded, his voice sharp but no longer as resonant as before. "Do you know who you're talking to?" "I am talking about the medicine," Harold replied, "and about the people waiting for it." A cough rose from the line behind them, long and exhausted. A woman clutched her chest, struggling to keep her breathing steady. The sound slipped into the space between the two men, a reminder that what was being argued over was not pride, but time and life. Kane looked at Harold, then at the crowd. He felt the pressure closing in on him, not from superior orders, but from the attention of people who normally had no right to speak. He hated that feeling. He was used to gazes turning toward him as recognition, not judgment. "Who do you think you are?" Kane repeated. He questioned, singing the weight each time it was spoken. Harold did not answer that question. He looked at Kane, then at the medicine cabinet once more. That simple, decisive gesture made Kane understand that the exchange had crossed into different territory. It was no longer about an old man standing in the wrong place. It was about what was allowed to happen inside this GP tent. A young medic near the supply area shifted position, as if trying to shield the cabinet with their own body. A small action, but not one that escaped Kane's notice. He inhaled, trying to reorder his thoughts. In this field medical post built on old ground, every mistake left a trace, and some answers, once spoken, could never be taken back. Harold remained silent after his last statement. He had said enough. The rest no longer lay with him. In that moment, the laughter that had once kept Kane standing vanished completely, leaving behind a void that raw authority could not easily fill. Harold's remark about the medicine vials falling into the GP tent landed like a heavy object no one wanted to pick up. The air froze for a few brief seconds. Kane stood there, his gaze flicking quickly from Harold's face to the medicine cabinet, then to the people around him. He felt the thing he hated most, a silence that was no longer submissive, but observing. "Fake veteran," Kane shouted, his voice high and sharp, as if volume alone could fill the gap that had just formed. He pointed straight at Harold, his arm rigid with tension. "Disturbing public order." A few people flinched, but no one laughed. No one joined in. The sounds that had previously helped Kane stay upright vanished, leaving only the steady hum of the breathing machine echoing from inside the tent. Threatening the security of the medical station, Kane continued, stressing each word as if reciting familiar charges. He believed in the power of language backed by the system. These words had once been enough to make others step back. Harold said nothing. He stood still, his eyes fixed on Kane, but without challenge. That very calmness irritated Kane. He needed a reaction, needed fear, needed a sign that he was still in control of the situation. "Restrain him," Kane barked, turning to the group of soldiers nearby. The order was thrown out quickly and decisively, like a practiced reflex. In previous situations, those words had always triggered immediate action. This time was different. The two sergeants closest to Harold hesitated for a beat. Not long, but long enough to reveal doubt. No one laughed. No one shouted encouragement. The crowd remained silent, eyes tracking every movement, as if they were witnessing something rare. Power placed under a spotlight. A young sergeant standing near the medicine storage stared at the bracelet on Harold's wrist. He had seen it yanked away, tossed like a toy, then put back on with a calm gesture. He had also heard the questions about the medicine and seen the metal cabinet door hastily shut. Everything rearranged itself in his mind, not according to orders, but according to an uncomfortable chain of logic. Kane noticed that look. He turned toward the young sergeant, about to say something, but the sergeant had already turned away, not turning away out of fear, but turning away to do something else. He moved quickly toward the communications desk, bent down, and spoke quietly to the duty officer. His voice was low and urgent, strictly by the book. Kane did not notice right away. He was busy maintaining his image in front of the crowd. "What are you waiting for?" he shouted, turning back to the soldiers. "Carry out the order." This time, the two sergeants stepped forward. They took hold of Harold's arms, their movements neat and trained. Harold did not resist. He adjusted his stance to keep his balance, his gaze still directed at Kane. There was no struggle and no protest. That was precisely what made the restraint look more exposed, like an unnecessary act that was still being carried out. The crowd stirred. A woman raised a hand to cover her mouth. An older man murmured something very softly. No one stepped forward to stop it, but no one approved either. This silence was heavier than any shouting could have been. "Do you see?" Kane said, his voice lower now, as if speaking privately to Harold. "This is the result of not knowing your place." Harold looked at Kane, his expression calm. "You're afraid," he said, his voice low enough that only Kane could hear. "And you're making noise to cover it up." The words made Kane falter for a split second. He brushed it off immediately, turning to the crowd, trying to regain control. "Disperse," he barked. "Anyone who hasn't been called yet, stay in your position." Inside the tent, a medic stepped out, about to say something, then stopped short at the scene in front of them. Their eyes moved from Harold to Kane to the two sergeants holding him. The air inside the tent seemed to thicken. At that moment, another sound came from outside. First, an engine in the distance, then the screech of sudden braking, followed by the short, sharp wail of a military police siren. The sound cut through the canvas, slicing across Kane's orders like a knife. Kane turned his head on instinct. He recognized the sound immediately. It was not a supply vehicle, and it was not an ambulance. The confidence on his face wavered. A few seconds later, the tent flap opened. An older man stepped inside, his uniform immaculate, his manner calm but firm. Major General Robert Thorne. His mere presence instantly shifted the atmosphere in the GP tent. The whispers stopped completely. The sergeants straightened up by instinct. Thorne's eyes swept quickly over the scene, from Harold being held to Kane standing in front, then to the medicine cabinet. His gaze lingered on the bracelet on Harold's wrist for a beat longer. Then he stepped forward and stopped in front of Harold. Thorne snapped to attention and raised his hand in the highest formal salute. "Sir," he said, his voice deep and clear. The entire tent froze. The two sergeants holding Harold immediately released him and stepped back on reflex. Kane stood rigid, his face draining of color. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The accusations he had just shouted suddenly lost all meaning. Harold raised his hand, the motion light but firm, stopping the formalities. "Don't," he said. "Don't turn him into a scapegoat." Thorne paused, lowered his hand, and looked at Harold with unmistakable respect. The crowd held its breath, waiting. "He's just a product of a system," Harold continued, his voice slow and steady, carrying through the tent. "A system that has grown too accustomed to trampling the weak and calling it order." No one spoke. Kane lowered his head, his eyes no longer able to find anything to anchor to. The people standing in line looked at one another, for the first time that day. To avoid the gaze of power. but to confirm that they had just witnessed something that had truly changed. Outside, the sound of the military police vehicle still echoed. Inside, silence settled over everything. No longer fear, but a wordless indictment for everyone who had grown used to wielding power without explanation. Who do you think is truly guilty? The people, or the system? Major General Robert Thorne stopped in front of Harold. He did not ask questions, nor did he survey the crowd first. Thorne straightened his posture and raised his hand in the highest formal salute, the movement so precise that every other motion in the tent seemed forced to halt. "Sir," Thorne said, just 2 words, brief and unmistakable, yet enough to completely reverse the atmosphere. Kane turned pale. He stood frozen in place, his mouth opening and then closing, as if every sentence he had prepared in his mind had been wiped away. The soldiers standing near him instinctively adjusted their posture, their backs straighter, their eyes no longer daring to drift toward Harold. In that moment, authority inside the medical tent was cleanly snapped. Without a single shouted order, Thorne lowered his hand and stepped 1 pace closer to Harold. His gaze passed over Harold's wrist and stopped at the old silver band. Thorne bent down, picked it up from Harold's hand, and held it in his palm as though it were something familiar. He turned it slightly, examining the faded symbol, his fingertips pausing at a deep scratch, where time and repeated use had left a clear mark. "A wartime medical monitoring band," Thorne said quietly. He was not explaining, but restoring the meaning of that small object within a space that moments earlier had been filled with judgment. The words carried with them a past that Kane was wholly unprepared to confront. "Sir, I was just," Kane stammered, his voice breaking on the very first word. He stepped forward half a pace on instinct, then stopped short when he met Thorne's eyes. The words that followed lodged in his throat, unable to find a way out. "Silence," Thorne said. A single word, decisive. No raised voice, no explanation. Kane fell quiet at once, his jaw clenched, his eyes wavering between fear and helplessness. Those who had laughed along with him earlier lowered their heads, as if the ground beneath their feet had suddenly become worthy of study. Thorne placed the band back into Harold's hand, his movements slow and respectful. Then he turned to face Harold, his voice lower now, carrying the seriousness of someone asking a critical question. "What do you notice?" Thorne asked. Harold did not answer immediately. He looked around the general practice tent, at faces pretending to be busy, at eyes avoiding contact, at hands that suddenly found something to do. Then his gaze settled on the supply storage area, where a metal cabinet door had just been hurriedly shut. He said nothing for a beat, allowing the silence to spread on its own. A medic standing near the storage area swallowed hard. The sound was small, but it rang clearly in the taut silence. That person turned away, pretending to inspect a tray of instruments, a slight tremor in the hand as it was set down. Another sergeant adjusted his glove straps, repeating the motion unconsciously, as if clinging to routine to stay composed. Harold turned back to Thorne. "Something here is being hollowed out," he said slowly. His voice was steady, carrying no direct accusation, yet every word landed exactly where it should. The statement did not target a single individual, but the way the system was functioning beneath its surface discipline. Thorne did not respond at once. He followed the direction of Harold's glance, then shifted his gaze to Kane. That look made Kane lower his head a fraction more. "Are you certain?" Thorne asked, his voice still calm, that of someone accustomed to managing crises. "I do not speak unless I see," Harold replied, "and I do not ask unless the answer matters." Thorne gave a slight nod. He turned to the group of medics standing nearby. "Who is responsible for this supply storage?" he asked. No one answered immediately. The hesitation stretched longer than normal, long enough to become a sign in itself. "Who is responsible?" Thorne asked again, his voice deeper this time. A young medic stepped forward half a pace, then stopped, his eyes flicking briefly toward Kane before he lowered his head. "Sir, Sergeant Bell handles overall consolidation," he said softly. Kane jolted. He lifted his head, about to speak, then restrained himself when Thorne turned to look at him. "You do not need to speak right now," Thorne said to Kane, his tone firm without being loud. "You have said enough." Thorne turned back to Harold. "When did you notice the signs?" he asked. "When questions started being treated as disruption," Harold replied, "and when someone tried to hide a vial instead of explaining." Several people in the tent exchanged glances. No one spoke, but tension spread, like fine cracks forming across a surface that had seemed solid. Kane drew a deep breath, trying to recover his voice. "Sir, the station is overloaded," he said, more cautiously this time. "There may be management errors. We will conduct an internal review." "No," Thorne replied at once. "We will conduct the review." He emphasized the word "we," enough for Kane to understand that control had left his hands. Thorne turned to the 2 military police officers standing near the entrance. "Seal the supply storage," he ordered. "Conduct a full audit." The order was carried out immediately. The two officers moved to the storage area and placed temporary seals on the metal cabinet doors. The sound of the lock closing rang dry and sharp, like an irreversible marker. Some medics exhaled in relief, while others stiffened, their eyes wavering between anxiety and expectation. The crowd outside the tent stirred, then quickly fell silent as they realized what was unfolding. No one was called forward for treatment at that moment, yet no one left. They stood there, witnessing a different kind of order taking shape, one where questions were no longer treated as a threat. Kane stepped fully back, no longer occupying the center of anyone's attention. He looked at Harold, then at Thorn, then at the sealed cabinet doors. In his mind, one thought became clearer than ever. What had just happened would not end here, and he, who had once believed himself the arbiter of judgment, was only the visible surface of something much larger, now beginning to be pulled into the light. Harold remained still, his expression calm. He knew this was only the first crack. Behind the canvas walls of the medical tent, behind the crisp orders and steady voices, many other things were still waiting to be revealed. The review began immediately after the medical supply depot was sealed. It did not unfold like a familiar administrative procedure, where forms were filled out and signatures added for completion's sake. The air inside the GP tent tightened with each passing minute, like an open surgery in which every movement risked exposing something long concealed. Crates of medicine were dragged out and lined up. The inventory ledgers were brought over and placed on the field table at the center of the tent. Major General Thorne stood there, saying little, merely signaling for them to begin. The medics opened the ledgers one by one, cross-checking each line and each symbol. At first, everything appeared normal, until the figures no longer aligned. "Missing here," one medic said quietly, his finger stopping on a single entry. "The quantity does not match the stock." Another flipped to the next page, his voice lower. "Strong painkillers, short every time." Thorne stepped closer and leaned down to look. "How much is missing?" he asked. "Not much each time," the medic replied, "but it repeats." The next pages were turned more quickly. No one maintained the initial calm rhythm. The entries began to connect on their own, forming an unsettling pattern. Strong painkillers disappeared on a regular cycle, not once, not randomly. Precise timing, precise amounts, small enough to avoid immediate attention. "Which shifts?" Thorne asked. Another medic answered after rechecking the duty roster. "These shifts," he said, pointing. "Always those shifts." A brief silence followed. Those standing around looked at the roster, then at one another. Drugless shifts. The phrase had never been spoken before, yet everyone understood what it meant. Shifts when patient numbers were high, but the medicine ran out faster than usual. Harold stood slightly farther back, observing. He did not touch the ledgers. He did not need to. The repetition of the figures said enough. He had seen such patterns in other systems, in other places, where supplies vanished in ways that made people doubt their own memory before suspecting another person. Thorne raised his head. "Who is in charge?" he asked evenly. A young medic nearby hesitated, then answered softly. "First Sergeant Bell, sir." The name was spoken without force, yet it spread quickly through the air. A few people exchanged glances. Others lowered their heads. Harold recognized the reaction at once. It was the response of people who knew the name had been mentioned before, always in contexts where it was best not to ask further. "Call Bell," Thorne said. Not long after, Marcus Bell appeared at the tent entrance. He walked in at an unhurried pace, neither fast nor slow. His uniform was immaculate, his face showing no surprise. Bell scanned the scene, assessed it within seconds, then fixed his gaze on Thorne. "Is there a problem?" he asked calmly, as if entering a routine meeting. Thorne looked directly at him. "You are responsible for the medical depot, yes?" Bell replied immediately. By assignment. Thorne did not answer, only signaled for the ledger to be handed to Bell. Bell took it, flipped through several pages, his expression unchanged. "Figures like these are normal under overload conditions," he said. "Loss is unavoidable." Harold watched Bell from behind. His gaze rested on how Bell held the ledger, on the confidence that required no concealment. He understood at once. This was not an improviser. This was someone accustomed to running things. "The loss follows a very regular cycle," Thorne said. "How do you explain that?" Bell shrugged lightly. "Patient demand increases at certain times. Busy shifts use more. But busy shifts do not match the drug shortages," Thorne replied. "They match your shifts." A beat of silence passed. Bell looked at Thorne, then at the duty roster. He smiled, a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. "You are speculating," Bell said. "This is not an interrogation room. This is a medical station," Thorne replied, "and I am responsible for it." Bell nodded, as if accepting the answer, yet the smile remained. He turned to look at those standing around, his gaze pausing briefly on Kane. Kane stood still, not daring to return the look. Bell then turned to Harold for the first time. Their eyes met. Harold needed no time to read Bell. He saw the calm of someone used to standing behind the curtain, where all the levers rested in his hands. Bell saw something else in Harold, not official authority, but an unsettling understanding. "Who are you?" Bell asked, his tone still polite. "Someone standing in line," Harold replied. Bell let out a soft laugh. "Then you should let us do our work." Harold stepped forward half a pace, close enough for Bell to hear without drawing attention. "You have been running this for a long time," he said quietly. The smile on Bell's lips faltered for a very brief moment, then returned. But Harold had seen enough. He stepped back to his original position, his gaze never leaving Bell. Thorne observed the exchange. He closed the ledger. "We will continue the review," he said, "in detail." Bell nodded. "I am ready to cooperate." He turned to leave the tent, but paused at the entrance. "I only hope this does not disrupt the work of saving lives," Bell said, his voice carrying calculated concern. Thorne watched him. "It is precisely because we save lives," he replied, "that we must clarify this." Bell stepped outside, his footsteps fading away. Inside the tent, no one spoke for several seconds. Harold stood still, his eyes following the direction Bell had gone. He knew the curtain had just been drawn aside, and the one standing behind it had been revealed. The air inside the GP tent did not ease after the order to seal the drug storage. On the contrary, it grew heavier and more enclosed, as if everyone understood that what had just been exposed was only the outer layer. Marcus Bell stood in front of the audit table, his hands loosely clasped behind his back, carrying the posture of someone accustomed to scrutiny, yet convinced he still held the upper ground. He did not avoid Harold's gaze, nor did he appear uneasy in the presence of Major General Thorne. Bell understood well the value of maintaining a calm tone when authority was being challenged. "You are making false accusations," Bell said, his voice cold and decisive. Two short words, without further explanation. He did not feel the need to justify himself because, in his mind, the right to question had never belonged to someone like Harold. Harold looked at Bell, his expression retaining its familiar composure. "No," he replied. "I read the data." His voice was not raised, but it was clear enough to cut through Bell's attempt at dominance. He did not speak of feelings, nor of suspicions. He spoke of recorded figures, the very things Bell had always believed could be adjusted or concealed. Bell curled his lip slightly and turned halfway toward Thorne. "Data in field stations is always inaccurate," he said. "Overload, constant shift changes, and inexperienced staff. Losses are inevitable." Bell spoke as if reciting a familiar report, a language designed to wear down all doubt. Harold did not argue directly. He walked slowly toward the back of the tent and stopped at the medical waste collection area. Gray plastic containers were neatly stacked, labeled for biohazard disposal. "Medical waste routes," Harold said, turning back to Bell. "These containers leave the station on a fixed schedule, never late, never early, always the same vehicle, the same route, the same handler." He paused briefly, "and they always coincide with shifts when strong painkillers disappear." A medic standing nearby had trembling hands and dropped a clipboard to the ground. He bent down quickly to pick it up, avoiding Bell's gaze. Tension spread, not through voices, but through small, uneven movements. "You are speculating," Bell replied, his tone still composed. "Medical waste is medical waste. No one sends usable drugs for disposal." Harold met Bell's eyes directly. "Then why are the shortages always on your shifts?" The question was asked lightly, but it forced Bell into confrontation. Bell let out a dry laugh. "What do civilians need premium medicine for?" he said. The words slipped out quickly, almost unconsciously, then hung in the air. "Priority goes to the forces here. What remains? If it works, it works." Silence enveloped the GP tent. A female medic standing near the records table lowered her head, her shoulders trembling slightly. Another person turned away, as if unwilling to hear more. Bell's words crossed the boundary of reasoning and struck directly at what everyone had been trying not to see. Harold did not take his eyes off Bell. "You create scarcity," he said. "You let drugs disappear at the exact moment patients need them most." His voice was even, not harsh, yet every word landed precisely. "When medicine is gone, time becomes a commodity." Bell folded his arms and stepped forward half a pace. "You are assigning motives," he replied. "All decisions here follow procedure. I am not responsible for patients' emotions." "And then you resell lives," Harold continued. "No need to open a market. Just let shortages happen at the right moment and sell the surplus elsewhere." He looked toward the waiting line, where a man was coughing violently, gripping a folding chair. "Those people do not know they are are being placed in a bargaining position. Bell spun abruptly toward the female medic who was still looking down. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice suddenly softer. "You should rest." She nodded without speaking, stepped backward, and tears fell onto the dusty ground. Thorne remained still, observing. He did not intervene because he understood that Bell was revealing more than any interrogation could. When someone in control begins to shift tone, that is when the shell of discipline has cracked. Bell turned back to Harold, his eyes sharp and cold. "Watch your words," he said. "Some things, once spoken, carry consequences." Harold responded immediately. "Some actions can never be hidden." He walked slowly closer to the records table. "You rely on artificial discipline to protect a network. You call it order, but in truth, it is a black market." Several people in the tent took deep breaths. No one objected, but no one stepped forward to defend Bell either. This silence was different from before. It was not fear, but anticipation. Bell looked around and realized that his familiar authority was losing its effect. He turned to Kane, his gaze cold and concise, requiring no lengthy explanation. "Deal with him," Bell said. Kane stood frozen. He looked at Harold, then at Thorne, then back at Bell. In that moment, the order was no longer a professional reflex. It became a choice, and that choice was being watched by the entire GP tent. If the lives of the poor are put up for sale, who is the real criminal? Follow to see how Bell will be exposed. After Bell's brief command, the atmosphere inside the GP tent did not erupt as many had expected. Instead, it settled, heavy, and sealed, like a room whose windows had just been shut tight. Bell understood that violence at this moment would be too crude. Striking Harold in the middle of a medical station, in front of Major General Thorne, would only turn him into a symbol. Bell did not need another hero. He needed a man stripped of credibility. Bell pulled Kane aside into a shadowed corner where the lights did not fall directly. Behind a row of instrument tables, he opened his jacket and took out a small syringe with no label, the liquid inside clear. Bell's movements were slow and deliberate, unhurried, as if he had envisioned this moment long before it arrived. Bell placed the syringe into Kane's hand. "Just a side effect," he said, his voice low and even, devoid of emotion. "He's old." Kane stared at the syringe, his grip tightening slightly. "What kind of side effect?" he asked quietly, as though afraid someone might overhear. Bell tilted his head, his voice colder. "Temporary confusion, disorientation, incoherent speech." He shrugged lightly. "Old age, post-COVID complications. Any doctor would write it that way." Kane swallowed hard. An image surfaced in his mind of Harold standing still in the center of the tent, his calm gaze unmoved by every insult thrown at him. He remembered the words about the system, remembered how Harold had not attacked individuals, but exposed the structure beneath them. Kane clenched the syringe more tightly. "What if he dies?" Kane asked, his voice nearly a whisper. Bell did not hesitate. "A stroke," he replied. 2 words, spoken lightly, like an administrative conclusion. "The records are full of cases like that." Kane looked at Bell and, for the first time, clearly saw the emptiness in his eyes. Not anger, and not blatant greed, but familiarity. Bell had done this many times, in many forms, to many different people. Harold was merely a new variable. "Do it quickly," Bell continued. "1 injection. After that, he'll destroy his own credibility. Every word he says will be dismissed as senile rambling." Kane nodded very slightly, but his feet did not move. He turned back toward Harold, who stood near the intake table under the watch of military police. Harold was not restrained, not being dragged anywhere. He stood there as part of the scenery, calm to the point of seeming out of place. Kane walked toward him, each step heavier than usual. The syringe lay in his hand, cold and slick. He tried not to look at Harold directly, focusing instead on the arm, on the spot where the injection could be done fastest. This was a familiar procedure, practiced hundreds of times in training, but Harold lifted his head. Their eyes met. Harold said nothing. He did not ask what Kane was holding, nor did he react to the approach. His gaze was calm and deep, as if he already understood what was about to happen. It carried no pleading and no defiance, only recognition. Kane stopped short. In that instant, the noise of the GP tent seemed to be pushed far away. He heard his own heartbeat. He remembered the way Bell spoke of lives as variables, remembered how Kane had laughed along with insults, had believed that power gave him the right to do so. Harold continued to look at Kane, unblinking. That gaze did not place Kane in the role of an executor of orders, but in the position of a human being standing at a boundary, "You don't have to do this," Harold said very softly. Not advice, not a command, just a truth spoken at the right moment. Kane's hand trembled. The syringe quivered lightly between his fingers. He drew in a deep breath, then let it out. Belle stood behind him, eyes sharp, waiting. He trusted in Kane's fear, believed it was strong enough to pull him through the final step. But Kane did not move forward. He looked again at the syringe, then at Harold. A beat of silence passed, longer than any command. Kane swallowed, his lips parting. He said, his voice hoarse. Belle frowned. "Do it," he urged, his voice low but harsh. Kane shook his head slightly. "I won't." The words came out trembling, but clear. They were not a challenge, but Kane's first refusal in his life to an order like this. Belle froze, his eyes darkened, not with surprise, but with anger struck at its core. He stepped forward, but Kane had already stepped back, the syringe still in his hand like evidence. Harold released a quiet breath, barely audible, as if he had foreseen this outcome, yet still allowed it to unfold by Kane's choice. Inside the GP tent, no one immediately noticed what had just occurred in that shadowed corner, but another crack had appeared, not in the records or the medical supply, but in the chain of command, long believed to be absolute, and this time, it began with a whispered sentence. Kane's words still hung in a corner of the GP tent like a cut that had not yet closed. Belle stood facing him, his gaze darkening, not from surprise but from offense. To Belle, Kane's refusal was more than disobedience. It was a rupture in the order he had built through fear and favors over many years. "Have you forgotten who you are?" Belle shouted, his voice sharp and heavy. He stepped close to Kane, close enough for the smell of antiseptic and sweat to mix. "Who do you think lets you exist here?" Kane clenched the hand holding the syringe, then loosened his grip. He did not answer. His eyes no longer searched for the familiar shield of protection. Belle noticed that immediately and understood just as fast. The tool had slipped from his grasp. Belle drew in a deep breath, forcing his anger down. He did not strike Kane. He did not raise his voice again. Violence at this moment would bring no benefit. Belle turned his back, his tone lowered but colder than before. "Fine," he said. "Then we'll use another way." That same afternoon, Belle had someone tail Harold, not openly, not theatrically. 2 trusted corporals were given a simple task: follow him and record every step. Harold was not detained. He was allowed to move within the station area, a largely symbolic concession. Belle knew that controlled freedom often created openings. Harold noticed the eyes tracking him very early on. He did not turn around, did not change his pace. He walked slowly past the auxiliary tents, where the roar of generators drowned out smaller sounds. His destination was the technical zone at the rear, where filters, temporary storage, and power lines were located. Cameras were sparse, with many blind spots, enough to construct a different story. Belle's 2 subordinates were already waiting. They leaned against metal crates, pretending to smoke, their eyes flicking up when Harold approached. One of them stepped forward, blocking the path. "Wrong area, old man," he said casually, as if pointing out a minor mistake. Harold stopped. He looked at the man in front of him, then at the other, standing at an angle behind. He understood their positions, the distances, the intent. "I am exactly where I need to be," Harold replied evenly. The second man gave a soft laugh. "This area is restricted," he said. "Turn back." Harold did not move. He did not strike first. He knew exactly what they needed. If he made the first move, the story would already be written. "What orders were you given?" Harold asked. The front man shrugged. "Not your concern." He reached out, intending to grab Harold's shoulder. That motion was the final line. When the hand made contact, Harold reacted, not fast, not brutal, but precise. He rotated his body slightly, swept the arm aside, and stepped into the opening he had created. A short, decisive joint lock forced the man down, breath bursting out in a sharp hiss. Before the other could react, Harold moved forward, stripped the baton from his hand in one clean motion, his wrist turning at exactly the right angle. "Let go," the man screamed. Harold said nothing. He pushed lightly, but with exact force. The man fell backward onto the ground, the baton rolling away. Everything happened in a matter of seconds, too fast for intervention, yet clear enough to be undeniable. One man lay curled, clutching his arm. The other panted, staring at Harold with eyes caught between fear and anger. The generators continued their steady roar, swallowing the chaos. Harold straightened, adjusted his breathing, and looked at the 2 men calmly and coldly. "I'm not so old that I've forgotten how to stand upright," he said, his voice low but clear. The words settled over the technical area like a marker. No explanation was needed. Harold turned and walked away, leaving the 2 men struggling to rise behind him. He knew that from this moment on, Belle had what he wanted, an incident that could be distorted. In the distance, another corporal was already jotting quick notes into a logbook. Bell would receive the report within minutes, and the story would be retold in a way that favored him. But Harold knew something else as well. Bell had chosen a louder path, and every loud step left a trace. The technical section, usually loud with the sound of generators, now carried a different rhythm. It was no longer the rhythm of running metal, but the pulse of a disruption that had just occurred. The two sergeants were still on the ground, not yet back on their feet, when hurried footsteps echoed from the end of the corridor. Flashlights swept across the metal walls, their beams slicing through the narrow space. The military police stormed in. They moved fast, in formation, eyes scanning without needing many questions. The scene was clear enough to require no explanation. One man lay curled up, clutching his arm, the other, gasping for breath, a baton rolling on the floor. Harold stood a few steps away, back straight, calm. Bell appeared right behind the military police unit, as if he had been waiting for this very moment. He pointed toward Harold, his voice sharp and high. "Arrest him," Bell said. "Disturbance. Assaulting personnel." A few military police officers hesitated for half a beat, their eyes shifting from Bell to Harold, then to the two sergeants, struggling to rise. That hesitation irritated Bell. "I'm the one in charge of this area," he snarled. "Carry out the order." Before anyone stepped forward, Kane emerged from behind. He came out of the shadow of a side corridor, his stride no longer uncertain, as before. Kane stood upright, took a step forward, and positioned himself between Bell and Harold. "Wait," Kane said. Bell spun around. "What are you pulling now?" he shouted. "You want to die along with this old man?" Kane did not look at Bell right away. He turned to Major General Thorne, who had just arrived with the military police. Kane's eyes met Thorne's, and then he stepped forward again, stopping directly in front of the general. Kane opened his hand. An unlabeled syringe fell onto a nearby metal table, producing a dry, sharp sound. The noise was small, but it drew all attention to a single point. "Bell told me to use this," Kane said, his voice trembling slightly, but unbroken. To disorient Harold, the entire technical section seemed to freeze. One military police officer turned to look at Bell. Another looked down at the syringe. Bell stood rigid for the length of a single breath, then forced a laugh. "He's talking nonsense," Bell said quickly. "A panicked guy who messed up," Bell said. Kane continued, his voice clearer now, that it was just side effects. Old age, post-COVID complications. If he died, it would be recorded as a medical incident. The final words landed heavily. Bell's face went pale. He stepped back half a pace on instinct, his eyes no longer able to maintain their familiar control. "You're digging your own grave," he said, his voice dropping. "Do you know what you're doing?" "I do," Kane replied. "I'm telling the truth." Thorne bent down, picked up the syringe, examined it briefly, then handed it to a nearby medic. "Seal it," he said. "File a report." Bell opened his mouth to protest, but two military police officers had already stepped forward. Cold metal closed around his wrists. The handcuffs, number 8, snapped shut with a dry, decisive sound. Bell jerked hard, but could not break free. He looked around, searching for a familiar face, a familiar protection, but all he received were averted gazes. "You don't understand," Bell said, his voice wavering. "Without me, this station will fall into chaos." Thorne looked at Bell, his voice deep and steady. "This station is chaotic because of you." Bell was led away. His figure disappeared behind rows of machinery, footsteps fading, leaving behind a strange emptiness. No one cheered. No one applauded. The collapse happened in silence, exactly the way this system had existed for so long. Harold stood still, watching. He did not step forward, nor did he turn away. Only when the last sound had faded did he turn back to look at those who remained in the tent and the technical section. The medics, the soldiers, the civilians crowded near the entrance. "Small people are not weak," Harold said. His voice was even not loud, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "They are only forced to be silent." No one responded immediately, but a few heads lifted, a few eyes no longer stayed fixed on the floor. This silence was no longer fear, but recognition. Kane stood a few steps from Harold, his arms hanging loose. He exhaled slowly, as if releasing a burden he had not even realized he had been carrying for so long. Thorne looked at Kane, then gave a very slight nod. Outside, the medical station continued to operate. Patients still waited, medics still worked, but something had changed. Not the physical structure, but the boundary of what was considered acceptable. Do you think society stays silent out of fear, or because it has grown too accustomed to being trampled? Share your thoughts. This story does not end here. The story ends here, but what it touches does not stop inside that military medical tent. Harold Whitman is not a hero carved into statues, nor a symbol meant to be celebrated. He is simply a person who refused to stay silent when silence meant complicity. Systems do not collapse because of a single punch, but because of a well-timed question, a gaze that does not lower itself, and someone who dares to ask, who gave permission? Somewhere in real life, there are still Marcus Bells, still Tyler Caines, standing at the edge of a choice, and still countless small people forced into silence just to survive. The only difference lies in whether someone dares to step forward by one step or not to become a hero, but to remind us that power does not generate itself. It only exists when it is allowed. If this story feels familiar, makes you angry, or makes you see yourself within it, stay, follow and subscribe to continue walking alongside stories that expose the dark side of power, where truth is not loud but strong enough to shake an entire system. And if you have thoughts, experiences, or simply a question that has never been asked, leave a comment. Silence is what they expect. Speaking up is the choice.